Color vision. The power of color as a perceptual experience is vividly illustrated by a painter who has lost his ability to see in color following a closed head injury that he suffered in a minor traffic accident. Sachs and Wassermann described in the late 20th century his experience as follows. He saw people's flesh, his wife's flesh, his own flesh, as an abhorrent gray. Flesh-colored now appeared rat-colored to him. The wrongness of everything was disturbing, even disgusting. He turned increasingly to black and white foods, to black olives and white rice, black coffee, and yogurt. These at least appeared relatively normal, whereas most foods normally colored now appeared horribly abnormal. He confused many things, such as gray and yellow socks, red and green peppers, mustard and mayonnaise. He could no longer see clouds, since they were indistinguishable from the apparently pale gray sky. As this person's experiences indicate, color is especially important for distinguishing between objects that are otherwise hard to tell apart. A simple scientific definition of color vision is, quote, the ability to distinguish between lights of different spectral composition, regardless of intensity, end quote. This definition captures an important aspect of color vision and helps us to understand color deficiencies, which are discussed later. However, color vision involves much more than wavelength discrimination. Natural surfaces vary intrinsically in terms of their propensity to absorb electromagnetic energy at some wavelengths and reflect it at other wavelengths, as discussed in spectral reflectance. For example, the chlorophyll in leaves cause them to reflect light predominantly as wavelengths around 555 nm, while the flavonoids in fruit and berries cause them to reflect most strongly around 600 nm. Estimates of surface spectral reflectance would therefore be very useful for the task of picking out ripe fruit from a leafy bush. Color vision involves neural computations, which endow us with the ability to estimate the spectral reflectance properties of surfaces. Before proceeding, it is pertinent to recall Sir Isaac Newton's observation that light waves or particles are not colored. Colors are entirely a construction of neural processes in the brain, and there is no simple fixed relation between light wavelength and color. The term color perception is tautological because color is a perception. The chapter begins with a consideration of the basic perceptual dimensions of color and then moves on to discuss the mechanisms that the visual system itself uses in order to estimate the spectral composition of light striking the retina. Again, we'll have what's called perceptual color space, which is a two-dimensional or three-dimensional geometric construct in which each point represents a particular color, and different colors are distributed along the axis of the space according to some organizing principle. And of course, then that's how we get to hue, saturation, and brightness. Of course, perceptual color space is simply a graphical representation of the hue, saturation, and brightness dimensions of color. For example, hue corresponds to the color itself, such as red or blue. Saturation corresponds to the purity of the color, often described in terms of how much neutral color, white, for example, is present. Pink is a desaturated red, for example. Brightness corresponds most closely to the perceived intensity of the light. And again, we have also what's called perceptual color space, and that brightness varies vertically. Hue varies around the circumference of the circle, and the saturation varies radically. The existence of unique hues and color descriptions led Ewald Hering, a German physiologist who lived from 1834 to 1918, to propose an opponent theory of color. He said, therefore, since redness and greenness or yellowness and blueness are never simultaneously evident in any other color, but rather appear to be mutually exclusive, I have called them opponent colors. To begin with, this term is used to characterize the way they occur without implying any sort of explanation. And again, Hering also proposed an opponency between light and dark sensations. The notion of opponency along the red, green, and blue yellow axes of color space has been very influential in the development of color theories, as later sections will show. Of course, the color space is a useful way of summarizing the ways in which humans describe specific pure colors. However, it is of limited use in understanding what happens when colors are mixed together, what color is seen in the mixture, and what, if anything, does that imply for theories of color. And again, we have, as part of color mixture, we have subtractive mixtures and additive mixtures. Subtractive color mixture is a color mixture created by combining dyes or pigments which act to remove certain wavelengths from incident light. And additive color mixture is a color mixture created by adding together different light wavelengths. And so the typical colors used in reproduction systems based on subtractive mixing, for example, we can have areas of overlap which indicate the colors seen in mixtures of the primary colors. So you could have blue, red, and yellow, for example, as the primary colors. And of course, we could have had, we have additive mixtures of 3 primary lights as well. And so we have blue, pink, and yellow for the reproduction systems based on subtractive mixing, and then green, red, and blue for the additive mixtures. And then we have metameric colors, which are 2 colors that appear the same hue but emit or reflect physically different light wavelengths. Metamers were studied by Maxwell in 1855 using discs painted with various color and rotated very rapidly in order to create additive color mixture. The choice of red, green, and blue primaries in color displays was largely pragmatic because it allowed the largest gamut of colors to be reproduced. No specific attempt was made to match the spectral properties of the primaries with the spectral sensitivities of photoreceptors. Of course, then we have a term called CIE chromaticity diagram, which is a standard graphical representation of the hue and saturation attributes of color based on color matching data obtained from large groups of observers. The CIE chromaticity diagram, pure spectral colors are arranged around the perimeter of the shape. Additive mixtures of wavelengths lie inside the shape. The color seen in a mixture of 2 wavelengths lies along a straight line joining the 2 wavelengths. Mixtures falling on the location labeled W appear white. The small triangle in the space represents the gamut of colors available in a typical LCD display. Of course, that's interesting. It's called the CIE chromaticity diagram. Then we have complementary colors, which are colors that cancel each other out when mixed together, producing neutral white or gray. And then chromaticity coordinates, the XY coordinates of a color in the CIE diagram. And of course, let's say you have 2 different colors. Let's say you have complementary colors, such as blue and orange. Mix it together, it becomes gray. Origin of additive color mixture. Although mixture of pigments is subtractive, there is one way to create a form of additive color mixture using pigments. The pointillist technique in art involves constructing a painting by placing every small dot of color next to each other. When viewed from a distance, however, at which the individual dots cannot be resolved, the dots merge together additively to create new colors. And then, of course, we have Helmholtz. Helmholtz had an estimate of 3 kinds of fiber responsible for color sensations produced in the latter half of the 19th century. We have a theory called trichromacy theory, which is the theory that human color vision involves three primary color sensations. Maxwell and Young were renowned British physicists who made major contributions in several fields. We discussed earlier in the physics of light. Helmholtz, however, was also a hugely influential German physiologist. Palmer, by contrast, was an obscure figure, better known in continental Europe than in his native Great Britain. Of course, he was a glass merchant specializing in colored glass, who spent much of his time in Europe and also published in French. Of course, Maxwell also conducted many quantitative experiments on additive color mixture using spinning disks, and writing in 1856, Maxwell supported Young's trichromacy theory as follows. We are capable of feeling three kinds of color sensations. Light of different kinds excites these sensations in different proportions, and it is by the different combinations of these three primary sensations that all the varieties of visible color are produced. And that's quoted in Helmholtz. Then there's what's called the dual processing theory. We have what's called the three pairs, for example, are called channels, the chromatic and one achromatic. A chromatic channel is a channel of processing in the visual system that conveys information about the chromatic or the color properties of the image. And the achromatic channel, a channel of processing in the visual system that conveys information about the luminance or the dark or light dark properties of the image. So there we have the chromatic conveys the information concerning the color properties of the image, and the achromatic tells you about the luminance or the light dark properties of the image. And then there is the color interaction, which is a change in the apparent hue, saturation, or brightness of a colored surface in the presence of or following exposure to an inducing color. So, for example, you can have color contrast, where the saturation of a color patch is influenced by the surrounding color. So you can have a light green surrounded by a darker green. Particularly strong contrast effects can be created by patterns in certain figures. The ring in the center of this annulus is uniform, but takes on a different color in the top left and the bottom right quadrants compared to other two quadrants because of the patterned surround. And then there is color adaptation and origins of color interactions. Color adaptation and color constancy. The effect known as color constancy is the apparent hue of a reflective surface remains constant even when changes in the spectral power distribution of the illuminant alter the wavelength reflected from the surface. Then there's cortical physiology, talking about the LGN. Then there's color deficiency, which is a reduced capacity to discriminate between colors, and it is caused by an abnormality in coned photopigments. And then what's called an anomalous trichromacy, or trichromacy, which is a form of color deficiency in which the individual processes three different cone classes, but their spectral sensitivity is shifted relative to normal trichromacy. Anomalous trichromacy. And then there is dichromacy and monochromacy. Dichromacy is a form of color deficiency in which the individual possesses only two cone classes. And then monochromacy, a form of color deficiency in which the individual possesses very few or no cones and is therefore unable to discriminate between colors. We talked about dichromacy and monochromacy. And then diagnosis of color deficiency. We have pseudo-isochromatic plate, which is a pattern of color dots used in the diagnosis of color deficiency. The shape seen in the dots varies according to the observer's vision color or color vision. And to sum up, we'll talk about the evolutionary genetics. You could talk about evolutionary genetics, visual ecology, or spatial resolving power. But in terms of color space, color descriptions are based on three dimensions: hue, saturation, and brightness. Herring proposed that the hue dimension contains two opponent pairs of colors, red-green and blue-yellow. Concerning color mixture, subtractive mixtures of pigments involve the removal of wavelength components from a stimulus. The colors that are seen in subtractive mixtures cannot be predicted straightforwardly from their constituent pigments. Additive mixtures, on the other hand, of light sources involve the addition of wavelength components to a stimulus. The colors that are seen in additive mixtures can be predicted on the basis of two rules: linearity and trichromacy. The CIE chromaticity diagram represented additive color mixtures in a standardized metric color space. A metametric match to any color can be achieved with an additive mixture of no more than three primaries. This fact led to the trichromatic theory of color vision. Metameric matching can be explained by the ratio of responses across the three cone classes. The two colors with matching cone ratios appear identical. Concerning dual process theory, it is the apparent discrepancy between Herring's opponent color theory and the trichromatic theory can be reconciled by what's called a two-stage theory, in which trichromacy forms the first stage and opponent processing forms the second stage. Dual process theory can explain how the visual system estimates the spectral composition of lights. Concerning color interactions, when a surface is surrounded by another color, its hue may be altered, and that is called contrast. When one color, for example, is viewed for a short time and then replaced by a test color, the latter color may be influenced by the first, and that is called adaptation. Color contrast indicates that the color of a surface is not determined solely by the triad of cone signals that it generates. Instead, a surface's color is determined by comparing its triad of cone responses with the triad of responses generated by the surrounding color. And color constancy. Concerning color constancy, color contrast and adaptation are thought to play an important role in color constancy, in which the color of an object remains stable even in the face of changes in the spectral composition of the illuminating light. And several other cues are also involved in the computations that achieve color constancy, including global contrast, luminance maxima, and mutual reflections. Physiology. Concerning physiology, dual process theory offers a good account of color processing up to the level of the cortex. Cortical processing involves single opponent cells which respond to large areas of uniform color, and double opponent cells which respond to color patterns and borders. Color opponent cells are thought to play a role in color constancy. Evidence for a specialized color center in the human cortex is not convincing. Color processing is closely linked to the processing of other attributes. Concerning color deficiency, observers with different or deficient color vision fall into three categories: those of anomalous trichomats, who require three primaries for metameric matches but in abnormal proportions; then dichromats, who require only two primaries to achieve metameric matches; and monochromats, who require only one primary and therefore cannot discriminate color at all. And then, of course, color deficiency is inherited genetically via a recessive gene on the X chromosome, so its incidence is much higher in males than that of females. And of course, and so that is our part covering color vision. And next we will go over spatial vision before we move over to shape and object perception.